It was one sentence, buried on page 47. That's all it took to destroy an entire neighborhood. We didn't notice it when we bought the house. Nobody did. The documents were thick, legal, dense. We signed where instructed. Closed on a quiet corner lot in a well-managed community. Karen had been HOA president for 4 years. Polished, organized, assertive. At the welcome meeting, she smiled warmly. We pride ourselves on maintaining standards. Standards sounded harmless, until she referenced a clause most of us had never read. The board retains discretionary authority to enforce community aesthetic consistency as deemed necessary. Discretionary authority, deemed necessary. Those words sounded flexible, reasonable, responsible. At first, enforcement seemed normal. Trash bins, lawn height, holiday decor timelines. Then a neighbor repainted his house, approved color, proper paperwork. 2 weeks later, he received a notice. Color inconsistent with evolving community palette. Evolving? There was no vote, no update, just Karen's interpretation. He appealed, denied. Another neighbor installed solar panels, city approved, HOA architectural form approved, but Karen invoked the clause, visual disruption of community harmony, fined, daily. Residents began rereading their documents. And there it was. One vague clause giving the board wide discretion, no clear limits, no objective standards. Just interpretation, and interpretation was controlled by one person, Karen. The clause became a weapon. Mailbox colors, driveway textures, fence styles, anything could be labeled inconsistent because inconsistency was undefined. Karen began issuing notices under the same language, board discretion exercised under Section 8.4. No explanation, no measurable criteria, just authority. Appeals went nowhere. The appeals committee, board appointed by Karen. One resident asked for objective standards. She replied calmly, community harmony cannot always be quantified. That sentence cannot be quantified, which meant cannot be challenged. Fines escalated, $150, $300, $500. Daily penalties for non-aligned property features. Homes that had been compliant for years suddenly weren't. Why now? Because property values had risen, and fine revenue had risen with them. Financial reports showed increased administrative income, but no capital improvements, no infrastructure upgrades, just growing penalty lines. Residents who questioned the clause found themselves cited more often, their homes reviewed, their features reassessed. Meanwhile, board allies remained untouched. The clause wasn't neutral, it was selective. Vague language gave power, and vague power invites abuse. The neighborhood changed. Paint colors faded into anxiety. Conversations shifted from barbecues to bylaws, and one realization began to spread. The problem wasn't the rules, it was the wording. One clause, open-ended, undefined, dangerous. We hired an attorney, not to fight the fines, to analyze the clause. He read it twice, then leaned back. This is unusually broad. Broad clauses aren't illegal, but they must still align with state HOA statutes, and state law required reasonable standards, objective enforcement, consistency. We requested documentation showing how aesthetic consistency was defined. There was none. No measurable guidelines, no voting history expanding the clause, just board meeting minutes stating discretion exercised. We requested enforcement comparisons. Patterns surfaced quickly. Certain residents were cited repeatedly, others never, even when visibly similar inconsistencies existed. Selective discretion, which legally weakens discretion. The attorney filed a formal demand for clear definitional standards, voting history for clause interpretation, enforcement logs for the past 24 months. Karen responded aggressively, claimed homeowners were threatening governance, added late fees during the dispute. But something unexpected happened. Residents began comparing letters, side-by-side documentation, identical phrasing, identical citation language, different houses, different features, same clause. It became obvious. The clause wasn't protecting harmony, it was protecting control. An emergency meeting was called, attendance tripled. For the first time, people weren't arguing about paint, they were arguing about power. And when the attorney projected legal precedent stating discretionary clauses cannot override statutory fairness, the room shifted, because the one sentence that protected Karen was now vulnerable. The independent review dismantled it. The clause itself wasn't illegal, but its application was. The report cited inconsistent enforcement, lack of objective criteria, selective penalty escalation, failure to adopt measurable standards. The wording hadn't ruined the neighborhood, the unchecked interpretation had. All fines issued solely under the discretionary clause were voided, late fees reversed, pending liens withdrawn. But the deeper damage? Trust. Neighbors had turned on each other over paint, over fences, over aesthetic alignment, all driven by a sentence nobody understood. At the final meeting, residents stood calmly, not emotional, just informed. They voted to amend the clause. Clear definitions added, objective measurement standards required, board discretion limited. Then came the second vote. Removal of Karen as president. It passed decisively, not dramatic, decisive. As she walked out, the clause that once shielded her authority had been rewritten, bounded, defined, neutralized. Because vague power thrives in silence, but collapses under clarity. One sentence almost fractured an entire community, and one correction restored balance. If you've ever discovered a clause buried in fine print that changed everything, share your experience in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share, because sometimes the smallest words carry the biggest consequences.